by Popular Photography and American Photo magazines. These special edition DVDs take you on location with some of America's most acclaimed professional photographers. You'll see firsthand how their award-winning digital images are discovered, captured, and perfected to achieve stunning results. Grab your camera and get ready for this special Photo Masters edition of the Ultimate Photo Guide Digital Photography Series.
Hi, I'm Jim Zuckerman. I've been taking pictures for 40 years, writing books, writing magazine articles, leading photo tours, giving seminars. In all that time, I have tried to impart what I know to students in a very clear and concise manner, and that's what we'll be doing here in this DVD. We're going to go out into the field, and I will be demonstrating several things. How I think, how I set my camera up, exposure situations and how I handle them. And I'd like you to think of this as a personal workshop between just you and me, because in essence I'll be talking to you. I'll be going over the things that I think are the most important aspects of picture taking, both technical and artistic, that you need to know. And what I like to discuss the most are challenges that I face and how I overcome them. And then I will also go into some Photoshop tips, some images that I have manipulated to try to stimulate your thinking along those lines, because there's so much you can do in photography today. It's a great time to be alive and to be a photographer. It's worth getting up early to get this really beautiful light, because this is the best time of day to shoot. You have golden lighting, you have beautiful texture, and a semi-silhouette, depends on how you expose. So the consideration in photographing a sunrise mainly is exposure. You have to decide if you want the sky to be correctly exposed or the subject like the lighthouse. In this particular case, you have significant contrast. Digital technology can only handle so much what we call dynamic range. In other words, how much detail can we capture in the lighthouse and how much detail and color can we capture in the sky. It's really either or. Unless you get into a high dynamic range, which is a different subject, where you can combine dark and light in one picture. If you just take a simple exposure, you have to make that choice every time you shoot. In this particular case, I don't want to lose the color of the sky. That's really important. So I'm going to expose for the bright sky and let the lighthouse go dark as a silhouette. So every minute that the sun gets higher in the sky, the light actually gets less and less good. When you have this extreme low angle, you have all of the advantages of the color, the texture, long shadows. And the reason that I've chosen this lighthouse is because the graphic design is so strong. What defines the success of a silhouette is the beauty of the shape of your subject. The Portland headlight here has a classic shape, and it looks good really from any angle. So let me take a few more shots. Do a vertical. I use this bracket from Really Right Stuff. It allows me to very quickly make a vertical composition without angling the ball head. The reason I want vertical is because I want to include the foreground as a dominant element. Gives me a sense of depth. Another thing to be aware of, and this is a problem really, every time you shoot the sun, you always have lens flare. And if you look very carefully in your viewfinder, you can see it. With a wide-angle lens, usually the flare is very small. There's no way around that. If you include the sun in your composition, as I'm doing here, it's going to be there, period. We can remove it later in Photoshop, but that's your only option. So let me go back to horizontal. See how quickly that changes? And another thing to be aware of all the time, especially when you shoot bodies of water, is you want to make the horizon parallel with the top and the bottom of your frame. A slanted horizon looks ridiculous. And so be very careful about that. It's just a simple matter of running your eyes around your viewfinder to make sure that that horizon is parallel. So as the sun gets higher in the sky, the exposure changes. And I'm going to underexpose this a little bit using my exposure compensation to keep that sky nice and colorful. Later, when the sun gets higher, I can get detail in the lighthouse as well as the sky, but right now it's going to be a silhouette. I moved just a few feet away from the position I was at a second ago because I want to include, there's some rocks over here that are being lit nicely by the sun. At sunrise or sunset, things happen very fast, and you want to take advantage of the most beautiful light, so you have to work the scene. You have to look at it from this angle, from that angle, telephoto, wide angle. If you've got a zoom, like this is a wide angle zoom, it's a 16 to 35 millimeter on a full frame sensor. So I will go wide, I'll go narrow to see what I can include, because you can always throw away later, but the sunrise happens fast. And like I said, every second that the sun goes up, you're losing the beautiful light. So the advantage of digital technology now is that we can see exactly what we take, unlike before where you had to be absolutely precise with a light meter, handheld light meter, and you didn't see the film until, you know, hours or days later. But now we have the immediate feedback of our digital monitors here, and so I can see what the exposure is. Using my exposure compensation, I can adjust that plus or minus in third f-stop increments. So I'm going to lower the camera and include more of the foreground and less of the sky. That's always a nice look because you don't need necessarily a huge expansive sky when you have some nice foreground going on here. I can see that the lighting is still really nice on the rocks here. One thing also, very important, many people use auto white balance all the time outside, and I think that's not correct. I think you're making a mistake if you do that, because auto white balance wants to correct the color of light to make it white. Well, we don't want white light here, we want yellow light, the golden light of sunrise. That's one of the things that makes sunrise shooting so beautiful. If you use auto white balance, you'll have the nice low angled sunlight, you'll have long shadows and texture, but you won't have the golden color of light. So I use a daylight white balance. That makes all the difference in the world. Now the colors are appropriately yellow or golden. So I'm going to swing the camera out, and now I'm going to put the lighthouse at the extreme far right side of the composition, and I'm going to put the horizon line about in the upper horizontal third. According to the rule of thirds, that's a nice thing to do. When you do that, let me just mention this, when I lower the camera so the horizon goes across the upper horizontal third, the lighthouse gets distorted. When I put the camera such that the horizon is right in the middle, the lighthouse does not look distorted. But as soon as I lower it, the tall structure of the tower there leans to the right. It's a very unattractive look, especially when we all know that it's supposed to be vertical. Later, in Photoshop, you can correct for that. In the past, you couldn't. It was just, we had to live with it. So just keep in mind that there are techniques in Photoshop where you can actually straighten that structure to make it look correct. At the same time, you still have your horizon where you want it. Let me do a vertical from here. Okay, so I'm shooting this vertical right now, but I see in my viewfinder flare. Now that the sun is higher in the sky, the flare is going to be more prominent. It's in the lower right-hand corner, and like I said, there's nothing that you can do to get rid of it, no filter, no other technique except Photoshop after the fact. So what you can do is angle the camera in such a way that you position the flare perhaps in a different place where it's easier to clone out. If the flare is seen over these bushes here, that's tough. That's really tough to get rid of. But if it's over the water, I can clone other water over that flare and it's gone. I feel that I've worked this location here right now, and we're going to move to the other side of the lighthouse because the composition and the lighting will be really different. I was actually here about 25 years ago, and I remembered it all this time because it's such a graphic, classic composition. What you've got here is a leading line. This fence line goes all the way, brings our eye right into the frame. You have a really nice side lighting on the lighthouse, and with my wide-angle lens, I can even include the sun. I got all of it. Just like before, you have to be careful about the contrast in terms of your exposure. So, let me explain. Hang on, let me get the shot. I'm using my wide-angle lens, a 16-35, and I don't have a foreground that's really close to the camera, like 3 or 4 or 5 feet away, so I'm focusing on the lighthouse. If I did have a foreground very close, then I'd be using the concept of hyperfocal distance, which, to simplify it, basically means that you focus about 8 feet into the frame. Again, if I had a foreground really close to the camera and I focused 8 feet into the frame and used f32, that gives me the maximum depth of field I can have for that composition. But this foreground is maybe 20 feet away, so that means I can focus on the lighthouse. And I'm including this little structure here, so the leading line and this structure just focuses all the attention where it's supposed to be. Let me do a horizontal of this as well. I've got the horizon in the upper horizontal third. And again, the lighthouse is leading just a little bit, but I can take care of that later. The most important thing is to get the composition and the exposure. There's a brilliant reflection on the water here, and let me just say, with respect to exposure, a lot of people feel that their meters fail if you blow the highlights on that kind of reflection. The truth is that even to my eyes, there's virtually no detail there. As much of dynamic range as our brain has, that kind of reflection is blindingly bright, and it's going to be blown no matter what you do. If you shoot in RAW or JPEG or whatever exposure mode you use, it's going to be overexposed. But it should be, because that's how it looks. Let me also mention, I'm shooting in RAW. I never shoot in JPEG. Actually, I maintain that you should only shoot in JPEG if the pictures don't matter to you. If you're doing fine art photography like this basically is, you have to shoot in RAW for several reasons. First, you protect the highlights from blowing out. Not the reflection, of course, or the sun itself, but other highlights. 2, you have the best resolution you can get. And 3, you can manipulate the color and the contrast, the color temperature, after the fact very easily in RAW. And you can't really do that so well in JPEG. So let me raise the camera up and put the horizon right in the middle, where most compositional rules say you shouldn't do that, but I do it anyway because I like it sometimes. Check the LCD monitor. The exposure looks really good. You have different exposure mode choices here. You can use program, use shutter priority, aperture priority, or manual. Personally, I don't think manual makes sense, because all the manual means is that you look through the camera and then you physically change the dials. Why not let the camera do that for you to save time, especially when time is of the essence? I think in this situation, aperture priority would be a good choice. It's a good choice for most landscapes because you want to specifically choose how much depth of field you have. I want everything in focus from the foreground to the background. The fact that I'm on a tripod means that I don't have to worry about how long my shutter is. The lighthouse is not moving, there's no wind, and the camera is not moving. Shutter speed is not a consideration here. Only lens aperture is. In many other situations, most situations actually, shutter speed is very critical, but in a landscape situation when nothing is moving, doesn't matter if you're at 1 second or a 15th of a second, because nothing's going to move and your picture will be sharp. Let me switch to telephoto lens because I see another kind of composition that I'd like. Always turn the camera off when you change lenses because you don't want the electricity to go through the sensor drawing dust to it, making static electricity. Okay, I put my 70 to 200 telephoto on the camera just for a real tight shot of the lighthouse, excluding the sun. It's just a real nice, nice graphic design. Adjusting the exposure compensation to make the exposure what I want. One thing that I want to mention about telephoto lenses, if you have the image stabilization feature on your telephoto, Nikon calls it VR, Canon calls it IS. If you have that feature and you're using a tripod, turn it off. I shoot Canon, and they say that their most recent lenses you can shoot with the IS turned on, but it's been my experience that's not true. If you shoot with the image stabilization on, you will not get sharp pictures. I have found this out painfully in too many situations, and now I just turn it off. And the truth is, on a tripod, you don't need it really anyway. So, okay, I have a nice graphic there. I'm going to do one more shot. I'm going to put my normal lens on, the 50, and get a little wider than that. This is a nice composition. Okay, very nice. One thing that is affecting the exposure is the sky. When you have a bright sky behind your subject, in this case it's blue, but it doesn't matter the color. The fact that the sun is over here, so it's very, very bright. You can see me squinting as I look toward the camera because the sun is so bright. The front of the lighthouse is in shadow. My eyes can see it just fine because our brain has incredible dynamic range. But the sky is very bright, and the way meters work is that they're programmed to give you middle gray or middle toned. Ansel Adams called it zone 5. You can say middle gray, but the color is not the issue. It's middle tone is halfway between black and white. That's how meters think. So if meters see, for example, snow, they think to themselves, oh, middle gray, and they make your snow underexposed gray because that's how they're programmed. In this case, it sees that bright sky, it goes, oh, middle gray, and wants to tone the whole picture down so the sky looks underexposed or gray. I don't want that. I want detail in the lighthouse in the shadows. So the question is, in one shot, let's put Photoshop aside. In one shot, can you get detail in those shadows and still get the nice blue sky? The answer is no, you can't. It's just a limitation of our technology. So there's two ways to handle this. You can forget about the sky and expose for the lighthouse. You can always replace the sky in Photoshop if you want to do that. You can use HDR, which is a technique where you take several exposures of this, darker, lighter, 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 and then later in Photoshop you put them all together so you have the best of both worlds, or the best of all worlds. You have detail in the shadows, detail in the highlights, and detail in the sky. That's with digital technology help after the fact. If you rely on just one exposure, you have to make a choice. If you expose for the sky, then you get a silhouette of the lighthouse, or a partial silhouette. If you expose for the shadows, then the lighthouse is nicely exposed, but the sky is blown out. If you compromise, you probably won't be happy with that shot at all, because no part of the picture will be perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the HDR feature. I'm going to expose for the sky, and then I'm going to lighten it and lighten it again, maybe take 3 or 4 shots so I can put that together later in Photoshop. And I do that with my exposure compensation. So I will take several shots, and I will go in about 2/3 f-stop increments. You could use 1 stop, you could use 1/3, depends on how many frames you want to put together later. When this is done, I'll have a perfect exposure, blue sky, all the detail in the shadow that I can see with my eyes, but that digital technology just can't really capture in one frame. That obviously must be done from a tripod, and the tripod can't move, obviously, because otherwise the pictures won't align correctly later. Let me do a horizontal of this, and then we can move to a different location. The last time I was here, I was shooting medium format film, and I couldn't see my pictures until I got back home. I'm going to try one more composition. I've got a 15mm fisheye that's a lot of fun sometimes, and actually right now it looks great. One interesting thing about fisheyes is that if you put the horizon right smack in the middle of the frame, then there's no apparent distortion of the horizon. As soon as you tilt the camera down a little bit or up a little bit, the horizon will either curve down or curve up. But when it's right smack in the middle, there's no apparent distortion in the horizon at all. And because it's a 15mm, it's so wide that it just gives you a really unique kind of a look. You get an extremely elongated fence line, and the building on the right here is a little bit distorted. The lighthouse, because it's fairly far away, doesn't seem as distorted as it might. Fisheyes distort when you get really close to things. In fact, if you want to get back at somebody for something they've done to you, photograph them really close with a fisheye lens. They'll hate you forever. So here, let's just, let me do a vertical of this. See how easy it is to go from horizontal to vertical with this really right stuff ball head? It's great. And with the L bracket that they sell. Okay, let's move to a different location now. The thing about Portland light is that there are a million compositions. I just changed to climb down on these rocks here, and this is just one of so many places I could be. The frustrating part is I can't be everywhere at once. What I've chosen here is a really beautiful composition because the early morning light is just skimming the rocks, and these rocks have just fantastic texture. So I've got my wide angle lens, my 16-35, and I'm on about 20mm right now. Before I was talking about when you have a foreground very close to the camera, focus becomes an issue. You can't just focus on the lighthouse. So basically what you have to do is take your camera off autofocus. This is one of the times when you cannot rely on your autofocus mechanism. I'm going to focus about 8 feet to the camera. I'm using the f/22. That's the smallest aperture I have in this lens. So at f/22, given this composition and my close proximity to the rocks, focusing about 8 feet away, that will give me the most depth of field I can have for this composition. You have to have your foreground in focus. That's really important. Since the background is the subject, the lighthouse, that has to be sharp as well. So here's a situation where you can't compromise on depth of field. So let me shoot this. Another thing I've done, that's beautiful. Another thing I've done is I've put the camera on the self-timer. Because my shutter speed is fairly long, it's a 40th of a second. That's not real long, but it's long enough that I don't want to jar the camera when I shoot, when I push the shutter button. So I just use a 2-second self-timer, and that's enough to let the camera calm down, and I get a sharp picture with no evidence of blur at all. So what I've got here is a really nice foreground and a really nice background. That's what I call the classic landscape technique. Here's the formula that I learned many years ago from one of the great landscape photographers, David Munch, just by studying his work. What I do, what he did and what I learned from him, is I use a really nice foreground, which we have here with the rocks, a classic background. I have complete depth of field, I have a wide angle lens, and I'm fairly close to the foreground. That's really important. These first rocks here are maybe about 5-6 feet away. So by placing the foreground really close to the camera position, it actually looks disproportionately large. Wide angle lenses do not give us what we see with our eyes. They come sort of close, but it's different. Our eye doesn't see this disproportionately large foreground. If I place the camera position even closer, then it'll seem even larger, and I'll do that in a second, but let me just get a vertical shot here. I'm going to lower the camera, press the shutter, and the camera takes a picture in 2 seconds. It's really a beautiful composition. The vertical composition tends to elongate these rocks really nicely, and the lighthouse has really beautiful side lighting on it. The sun is higher in the sky, so it's not quite as golden, but it's still good. It's about an hour and 20 minutes after sunrise now. So let me go back to horizontal, and I'm going to lower the tripod so I'll show you how dramatic I can make that foreground. When you're working on rocks, knee pads help, but I don't have any, so I'll just suffer for my art. Okay, now I'm about 5 feet away to the rocks, and I'm going to still focus manually about 8 feet into the frame, use f/22 self-timer, and take the shot. That's really pretty. Let's get even closer to these rocks. What is so nice is that the early morning light is side lighting the rocks, and since these have such wonderful texture, they're just really, really nicely defined. It really holds your attention as you look at this kind of composition. Now remember, I mentioned before that if I put the horizon line near the top of the frame in the upper horizontal third, or even higher, the tower of that lighthouse is going to lean just a little bit, but we'll fix that later. Let me do a vertical here. This is really a classic scene. Remember that you have to keep that horizon line parallel, or else it looks ridiculous. Perfect. Perfect composition. So let me go to a different position, different rock formation. There's so much here. You could spend days and get different stuff. So let's change. In this new location, what I really like about this is that you have a interplay of dark and light with the rocks. The rocks down below are wet and they're dark. These rocks up here are very light, and so that contrast is really nice. Plus now we can see the water, and that's a nice element. So I still have it on self-timer, although to be honest, I don't really need it right now because my shutter speed is fast enough. Let me do a vertical here. On this camera, I have the option, this is the Canon 1DS Mark II, and I can change my focus from the shutter button, which most people use, to a back button on the back of the camera, and I just feel that's a faster way to do it. That way one button doesn't do too many things. Again, I'm very close to the foreground. I have my focal point about 8 feet away, and that means I have complete depth of field. I have to have these foreground marks sharp. If they're not sharp, it just won't look good. Out of focus foregrounds are visually annoying. You keep wanting to see them in crisp detail, but you can't because they're out of focus. So I find them very distracting, and so I make every effort to make my foreground sharp in most situations. Like in any art, there's always exceptions, but usually that's important to do. Also, the lens I have right now is a 16 to 35 millimeter wide angle. Gives me a really nice wide view. I'm working with a full frame sensor. That means that my focal length is exactly what it should be. There's no magnification factor. Many people use digital cameras where there is a magnification factor. In Canon, there's a 1.6 factor. In Nikon, it's a 1.5. So that means if you have like a 20 millimeter at 1.5, you really have a 30 millimeter. And that lens is not as wide as you might want. It doesn't have the drama that a real wide angle has. So in that case, both Canon and Nikon have come out with lenses that are specifically made for digital. For example, the Canon has a 10 to 16 millimeter. That's unheard of in traditional photography, but translated into a real focal length, when you multiply it by 1.6, the Canon magnification factor, it becomes exactly what this lens is, a 16 to 35. So if you like wide-angle photography and you've got a smaller sensor that magnifies the focal length, you might consider getting a lens that has that ultra-wide look. Let me just take another shot here. My horizon is perfectly parallel. I've got complete depth of field, and again, I still have the wonderful texture from the low-angled sunlight. Even though it's been a really long time since I've been here, the reason why it never left my mind, this location, is because there's so much to shoot. The reason why this is such a strong photographic subject is because the lighthouse has a beautiful graphic shape. Not all do, this one does. You can photograph it from any angle. You can photograph it from right behind the lighthouse itself, from this side, from the other side. If you're here, you have all kinds of different rock compositions. The early morning light gives you great texture here. So there's a lot going for it. To be honest, this is also a great sunset location. The sun comes from over here, a very different angle, and you get very different lighting. The sky also behind it, instead of the sun coming up behind the lighthouse, you often have really beautiful sunset clouds. So it's a fantastic location, and if you've never been here, I think you should definitely visit Portland Head Light and photograph it. It's exciting to be here. We were just leaving Portland Head Light, and I saw this other shot that I really liked. Another testament to how unique this place is, in that you can shoot it from so many different angles and get something really wonderful. What I'm doing now is photographing just the very top of the lighthouse itself with all the rocks in the foreground. I've eliminated the housing structure of the lighthouse and just got that one light tower. So it's make sure your tripod is stable when you shoot. It's not awesome, but it's really nice. And as long as I'm here, when I get every possibility that I can, I'm putting the lighthouse in the left vertical third in this vertical composition, and the rest of the shot is just rocks and texture. It looks really nice. Walking back to the car, I passed these really remarkable rock formations. The sun is high now and it's front lighting this section of the rock, but over here it's side lighting it. So you have really nice texture, but even over here with the front lit rocks, you got such amazing colors. I love photographing anything with green, to be honest, and there's all kinds of green and yellow and rust colors in here, great textures. And I was walking around here looking closely, thinking these make some really nice compositions. So I took my camera off the tripod because it's bright enough now so I have a fast shutter speed and I can still have f/16 at 200 ISO, which is what I normally use. And I was just looking through my lens at the various shapes, and I was thinking, wow, this is really beautiful. So what drew me first actually was this little corner here, because you have really nice graphic, artistic design. So let's go over here and take a look. I think this is really good. Let me explain how I approach this. First, I position myself squarely in front of the rock. And the reason I did that is because I want the back of the camera to be as parallel as possible to the rocks. That gives me maximum depth of field. If I were to shoot from an oblique angle, then depth of field becomes sketchy. You have to then have a small lens aperture, really small, because if you look at this, the reason why that works, here's what we used to call the film plane, but now it's like the sensor plane. But when the sensor is parallel with the subject, flat to it, every point on the subject is equidistant to the sensor. As soon as you angle the camera, you can see that this point is closer and that point's farther. And that's why you have a depth of field issue. So when I shoot this rock, I position myself squarely in front of it so the back of the camera, or the sensor, is parallel with that rock. So let me look at this. I think it's really beautiful. You've got this nice side lighting, so there's texture, very interesting colors and design, and in fact this whole thing is really interesting. So let me take a step back here and look at this wall. There's all kinds of shapes in here, and colors and textures. I'm using f/16. I have on aperture priority, so I can specifically control my lens aperture. The shutter speed is 160th, which is fine. I even have the image stabilization on because I'm hand holding it, not on a tripod. There's a few little wildflowers around here, and I have not chosen to photograph them because there's a little bit of wind. At dawn, usually the wind is absent, but as soon as the sun comes up and there's a differential of temperature, you get these slight breezes, and to be honest, wind is the enemy of macro photographers. It drives you crazy. The slightest movement means that you really can't shoot it. So I'm concentrating on the rocks, and I just think these are really, really beautiful. One of the things that I see in my mind when I look at these rocks is what I call hidden color. There's a technique in Photoshop where you can really enhance the color significantly, and the colors actually, they become, well, it depends how much you do it. It could be surreal, it could just be extremely exaggerated, but I think of it as hidden colors because the colors that you can see that really comes up in Photoshop may not be what you saw with your eyes at all. So as I'm shooting this, I'm sort of seeing what I can do with it later. And I just love the texture and the design here. I really like the combination of colors here. The lighting is flat, so we don't have the kind of texture that we do on this wall. But it's the colors that drew me here, because I can see in my mind these hidden colors later. And I stood on this rock here because I'm trying to get as high as I can to shoot down, which makes the back of the camera as parallel as possible to these rocks. So I'm going to zoom in for a tight shot. Whenever you have the combination of great lighting, really nice graphic design, good color, and good texture, you've got a winning picture. We've been scouting locations, and we just came upon this really, really beautiful church. It's not so easy to find a classic New England church with no power lines or telephone cables going across it. This is clean, and we happen to have a really beautiful fall foliage tree right in front. It's a perfect composition. The only problem is the lighting. We're at midday right now. It's about 2 o'clock. A little past midday. The lighting is in back of the church, so the front is in shadow, but the tree is glowing. Even though the tree is being backlit, those leaves are very bright in contrast with the dark church. In addition, the sky is light. If I expose for the front of the church, the sky is going to become overexposed and seem washed out. Unfortunately, you cannot be everywhere when the lighting is ideal. This would be great if the sun were on the front of it. It would also be great if it was a dark, stormy kind of sky, but you just can't do that, so you have to use Photoshop really to get exactly what you want some of the time. So I'm going to expose this. Well, you know what? A cloud just went over the sun. Now we have soft, even light. Let me shoot it real quick. Okay, let me lighten that up a little bit. Perfect. The reason I shot so fast was because the contrast was lowered. I didn't have such extremes between the tree and the church. So the sun just came out again. I've got beautiful backlighting, but we still have the contrast issue. So I'm going to shoot this so I can show you the results and talk about how difficult contrast can be. One possible solution to this contrast problem is HDR, or high dynamic range. The problem with that in this situation is that the leaves are moving. And so if you merge those pictures, you're going to get leaves that are out of register, and it just won't look very good. So what I'm going to do is I'll take one shot that I feel is properly exposed, in RAW of course, and when I output it, I can output it 2 or 3 times at different exposure values, and then merge that in Photoshop, and that'll solve the problem. Especially, the biggest problem here is the sky, because if I expose for down here, that sky is going to get too light. So let me do a few shots. There's one more thing that I wanted to mention, is that in the background here we have a multi-car garage, and I just think that's a little bit annoying. So I could clone that out, maybe clone foliage over that, but I'm going to angle my camera and see if I can get rid of that. In vogue today, in fashion, in wedding photography, in advertising photography, a lot of photographers are angling their camera and getting slanted subjects. 20 years ago, photographers would laugh at that. Today, it's like new fashion. So I think I can get away with it in this case. This is really a beautiful picture. Let me see how it looks horizontally. It may not work. Well, it works if I take care of the traffic over there and the garage over there. I can see from my monitor that the sky is light, but like I said, I'll take care of that later. I'm going to change position now. This tree is really beautiful and I want to see if I can use it as a frame to get a different angle on the church. I kept looking at this tree because it's so beautiful. I kept thinking there's got to be a composition here where I can frame the church in these beautiful, beautiful backlit leaves. So I walked all over here and I finally found one. And I really like it a lot. What I've got here, I'm on 16 millimeter and I'm extremely wide, so I've got the sun in the frame coming through the branches of this tree over here. I've got all this color here and the entire church. I'm cutting off the church just below the steps there because I hate including asphalt and concrete in my pictures, especially in the foreground. I find them unattractive. The only problem, as I mentioned before, are these garages over here, but I'm going to bring the foliage down and just clone them out later. Nothing I can do about that. So I think this is really beautiful, both horizontal and vertical. In the vertical frame, wow, I can get all these leaves up here as part of this enveloping frame that just surrounds the church. It's really beautiful. And again, I'm extremely grateful that I found this church with no power lines because they just junk up a picture. And even though they can be removed in Photoshop, it's a pleasure not to have them. So, going to try something different here. Going to angle the camera this way. But you know, as soon as you start angling the camera, the church starts distorting because of the wide angle lens. As soon as the plane of the sensor is oblique to the facade of the church, you start getting it distorted. But sometimes that can work. So as long as I'm here, I'm trying everything. I can always throw it away later. What's really nice about this is that those leaves are just glowing from within because of the sun coming right through them. It's perfect. Before I talked about unwanted contrast, but now I think from this angle, the contrast is sort of working in our favor. I've moved back from the church. Now there's a really beautiful rolling grass area in front. Nice color over there. But there's a problem, and that is I've got a wide angle lens and the sun is right over there. So I suspected there might be a little bit of flare, and when I looked in my lens, it's very, very subtle, but it's there. I wouldn't have been looking for it, except that I know that the sun is grazing the front element of my lens, the front glass element. As soon as I put my hand up here and made a shadow in the lens, I could see the flare in the lens go away. So that's what I have to do when I take the picture. That solves the problem. You still have the issue of the contrasty lighting, but there's a very thin cloud cover now and the sun is out, but it's softer. So that immediately reduces the contrast. I'm using the zoom on my wide angle to give me a real wide view and then to come in tighter. This is like a classic New England scene. It's really beautiful. The sun just went away, so let me do a few shots where the contrast is at a minimum. I'm adjusting the exposure compensation because when you have all these different tones in your picture, it's nice after the fact to be able to choose exactly which exposure you want to use. I'm also very careful to align the camera so that the bottom edge of the frame is parallel with the bottom edge of the church. There's a fence here in front, and I would consider using this as the foreground, but the sun is on it and there's too much shade back there. I think that would make the contrast problem too much. What I like about this composition is that the church is framed by all these trees. There is a technique in Photoshop whereby I can take these green leaves and make them red or yellow. So we have one really spectacular tree over there, but this tree, which should be red or yellow, isn't quite there yet. It's a little bit before peak. So if I want to later, I can make this tree really dynamic. We have been driving through New England, and right now we are in New Hampshire. What happens in this part of the country is that you never know what you're going to find around the next corner. There's a million little roads, and we passed this river, and I just said, hey, let's stop here because we have some great color. What you need for really good fall foliage is red. Got to have the red. And then you have the yellow and the green and other colors, but the red is really important. This is a really beautiful river, and we're on a bridge. In a way, it almost doesn't make sense for me to use a tripod because when cars come by, there's a little bit of vibration. So I'll have to be really careful when I shoot that there's no cars on the bridge making this thing shake. We have great lighting. Right now it's overcast, and for fall foliage, that's ideal. If the sun is out, as it was yesterday, there's too much contrast. Shadows go black, highlights can become overexposed, and I just love this really, really soft light. Here comes another car now. I can feel the bridge vibrate a little bit. There is a little bit of wind, so if I choose to use a slow shutter speed, I'll get some blur. And that may be desirable, may not. I actually would prefer not with this shot. I've got my 16 to 35 millimeter wide angle lens on, and I'm basically going to eliminate the sky and just get the foliage and the river. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want that very bright sky to be distracting. What happens very often when you have a very bright background and the rest is very muted, like it is right here, your eye goes to the lightest part of the picture first and it keeps going back there. So what that does is it pulls your attention away from the subject, which is the river and the foliage. So when I shoot here, I've got a wide angle, but I'm going to zoom in and eliminate that sky and shoot downward a bit to eliminate those hot spots in the sky. This composition works both horizontal and vertically. So lots of times I'll shoot the river right in the center of the frame, and sometimes I'll shoot it off center. Both can be nice. That's really beautiful. And then I'll center it. Perfect. Okay, the wide angle lens got a lot in. I'm going to switch now to a normal lens and just go for a tighter composition. I turn the camera off because we don't want electricity going through the sensor to pull static dust into the camera. So now I have a 50 millimeter normal lens on. This lens has apparently less depth of field than a wide angle. So that means I need a smaller lens aperture, which means the shutter speed is going to get slow, and therefore these leaves may blur a little bit. So let's see what happens. I try to wait for a lull in the wind actually, so they're moving less. I'm going to put the camera on aperture priority. And I'll use f11, so my shutter speed is a 20th. And there's a lull in the wind right now, so I'm shooting and I'll get a little bit of blur, but it's far enough away that it'll be pretty much insignificant. Let's do a vertical of it. Again, I'm eliminating the sky. I don't want to see any of that hot spot up there. Okay, perfect. So now we'll move on and find a different location. I'm just off another roadway. We found another spot to take some pictures. What I've been looking for in New Hampshire here are some small ponds with really beautiful trees right across the water to get that nice reflection, and it's a classic New England scene. Again, I've got soft diffuse lighting. There's a nice cloud cover over the sun, so the lighting has no contrast at all. It's really beautiful. I'm in an elevated situation like I was with the river, but this is actually higher, and I like it. It's unusual. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to handhold this because I have enough light for a fast shutter speed. Plus, I've got my image stabilizer on because I'm not using a tripod. And what's so beautiful about this, you've got red. You have to have red for the drama, and then you've got the yellow and the green next to it. It's perfect. The only problem, there's only one little teensy-weensy problem with this, and that is there's some leaves down there that could be seen as making the scene a bit busy, and it's not a perfectly clean reflection on the water. So I can handle that in a couple of ways. I can just accept it, I can clone them out later, or I can replace the entire reflection completely in Photoshop. So those are my three options. So let me take some shots here. I'm placing the water line in the lower horizontal third for one of the shots, and then in the vertical I did the same thing. I am specifically avoiding the sky. I don't want that bright area because everything down here is so muted, it'll be very distracting. As I look at this pond, there's some other compositions that I see too. There's some red foliage over here that I like. And again, you can see how the water is not as clean as one might like it. So I think I'll take care of that later. Something else I like to do very much is I like to shoot the reflection because there's a little bit of ripples in the water there disturbing the surface. If I shoot just the reflection without the water line and without the trees above, just the reflection, then when I show it to people, I flip it upside down, and it ends up looking like a watercolor. It's like an abstraction of the forest scene, and then you can increase the color and saturation and the contrast, and I'll show you later on the DVD. It's really cool. So I'm going to do that right now. Even though it's abstract, you still have to focus on it. And you end up actually focusing on the surface of the water, not really on the trees beyond the surface, because it's the surface of the water that needs to be sharp. So let's see what else. There's a nice orange tree over here, so let's do a vertical of that. That looks really good. Sometimes you don't get the intensity of color you want. In these trees I have the intensity, but the orange over here, it's not as brilliant as I'd like, but again, later in Photoshop I can bring that up and I can make it really pop. I know that some photographers don't like manipulating nature at all. They want to just photograph what they see. That's perfectly fine. I sort of see myself as a photographic artist. And so this is my palette, and like artists for thousands of years, I feel I can do to it whatever I want to make it as I envision it. And so that's what I do. I'm also going to do a tight shot of just the trees without any reflection because it's a beautiful, it's just a beautiful combination of color and design. This is really beautiful. In one stand of trees, you can get all kinds of different graphic designs. I've come down the slope to the water level to get a different perspective on this little pond. What's interesting when I get down here is that these floating leaves are now reflecting the light in the sky, and they're very light. And that is definitely going to be distracting. So I will definitely replace them. And to be honest, there are so many leaves floating on the surface of the water that it would take me forever in Photoshop to do it. It's doable, but it would take a long time. So it would be a lot easier for me just to replace the entire surface of the pond with a digital reflection. But the perspective on the trees is different, and I like it. So I'm going to take some shots here. I've chosen to use a tripod because I want some additional depth of field, because now the surface of the water is much closer to me than the trees. So that means I have some depth of field issues going on, and I want a smaller lens aperture. So I'm going to choose aperture priority. I'll choose f22. And that means that my exposure will be half a second. So I'm going to use the self-timer on the camera, a 2-second self-timer. That means that when I push the shutter button, there'll be a delay before the picture is taken, and so the movement in the camera, if there is any, won't be apparent in the final picture. Actually, what I really should be doing is choosing the mirror lockup option on the camera. And okay, I just set that. What that means is, in the camera, there's a mirror that goes up and down every time you take a picture. If you use a fast shutter speed, that mirror's motion won't affect the picture at all. You have a mirror because as you look into the viewfinder here, your vision goes down and then out through the lens. Well, you need a mirror right in the way of the sensor to do that. So the mirror has to flip up, the light comes in, hits the sensor, mirror comes down. That movement, like I said, can cause vibration, especially with a long shutter speed. So to ensure absolutely sharp pictures, when I push the self-timer, after the time goes, well, when I push the self-timer, the mirror goes up. 2 seconds goes by, and the picture's taken. So the mirror is not moving at all. So let me do that. Now I know the picture will be absolutely as sharp as it can possibly be. I just forgot to turn the stabilization off, so I just turned it off, so let me do it again. Remember, you must turn the image stabilization off if you're using a tripod, otherwise your pictures will not be sharp. Okay, I really like that composition. Let me do a vertical. Yeah, this is really nice. Okay. There's one more tree that I want to get over here. It looks really nice from down here. I have to move my tripod because that branch is in the way. Okay. Okay. This is the prettiest pond that we have found so far. And I'm really appreciative that we have the soft lighting that we do. And also, you can see that there's no wind. That really helps our case. In fact, I don't even see a ripple in those leaves, so everything will be tack sharp. We were on our way to another location, but we passed this wonderful cemetery in Weston, Massachusetts. It's a perfect day, and the leaves are falling. The ground is carpeted with yellow and down here red leaves. It's absolutely beautiful. I almost don't know where to begin because there's so many possibilities. We have front lighting, side lighting, back lighting. We have rows of rim-lit stones. This is an old cemetery, so it's classic New England. I'm going to begin with my wide-angle lens because I see a lot of wide-angle possibilities here. In this situation, I'm going to be using backlighting. The stones will be backlit. The ground has wonderful texture from the sun that is fairly low-angled. But I want to point out one really important thing. When you shoot toward the sun, you're going to get lens flare. I get questions on this all the time from my online students and when I give seminars and workshops. People always want to know, how do you get rid of lens flare? The problem is, if you include the sun itself in the composition, you can't get rid of it. It's going to be there. You can make it less by angling the camera just a little bit, and maybe it goes down over this area instead of right down the middle of your frame, but it's going to be there. But what I've got right now is I'm shooting toward the sun, but the sun itself is not included. So I suspect that there's going to be flare, especially because my lens is wide and the sunlight is coming into my lens from that angle. So if I expect it, that means I can see it in the viewfinder. It may be very subtle, but it's going to be there. The way that you can get rid of it is by taking your hand and just shielding the lens from the sun. Actually, it just went behind a cloud right now, but it'll be out in a minute. Here it comes. As long as that sun is hitting the front glass of the lens, there's going to be flare somewhere in there. So when I get down here to compose this picture, in the lower left part of my composition, I can see it's a little bit of green. So I'm going to take my hand and just cup the lens. With a wide-angle lens, or actually with any lens, you've got to be careful not to get your hand actually in the lens itself. You don't want to see it. It's just above, because sometimes there's a very thin line between seeing your hand and blocking the flare. So, could I use a lens hood? Yes, I could, but especially with wide-angle lenses, I don't believe that the lens hood is going to do as tight a protection of that lens as my hand can do. My hand can get right along the edge of where I see it and where I don't see it, whereas the lens hood gives you a little bit of breathing room. Well, in that breathing room, you can get some flare. So let me change position here and do another shot. This is a nice backlit shot where I'm using this headstone as a dominant element. This is what I call the classic landscape technique. Wide-angle lens. I'm maybe 3 feet from this headstone, very, very close. I have focused about 8 feet into the frame. That assures me of maximum depth of field if I use my smallest lens aperture, which I am. My ISO is 200. I could use 100, but gives me a little extra speed for the 200. And I have set the camera on mirror lockup because nothing is moving except the falling leaves really. And so I don't want anything to possibly introduce any kind of blur into my system here, so I get a tack sharp picture. Let me do a vertical of this. Okay, right now I'm actually seeing the sun, so, and I can actually see that lens flare in there too, but the lens flare is coming across the picture right in front of the headstone. The headstone is dark, and so I can use some Photoshop techniques in cloning and reducing the saturation of that color, so it'll pretty much disappear. One more thing I want to mention is that when you take a picture of a point source of light with a small lens aperture, you will typically get a star. So the sun itself will look like a little starburst in the sky, and that's just inherent in the way the light reflects off of the diaphragm inside the lens. So let me change positions here. I'm going to find a different composition because there are so many. Let's move right over here. From this position, I'm actually using the tree to block the sun. That way there's no flare problems. I can still have some really nice backlighting on the leaves, but there's no worry about any kind of flare because of the tree. I'm putting the tree along the right vertical third. Based upon the rule of thirds, that's what they suggest for an attractive composition, and it works much of the time. Sometimes I want something right in the middle, but in this case it works very nicely. I've got the self timer on, 2 seconds, and my mirror lockup. And the exposure is really good. What I do typically in a situation like this, because I'm so concerned about blowing the highlights, I will underexpose my pictures by 2/3 of an f-stop. A lot of photographers disagree with me on this, but my feeling about that is that this is not enough of an underexposure to cause unwanted digital noise, but it's just enough to protect the highlights. Because right now we've got the sun shining through and on a lot of yellow leaves, and they're bright. And they're a lot brighter than, let's say, the shadow of this tree here and the shadow of the headstones. That kind of differential and contrast, where you have a bright yellow leaf and a very dark shadow on the side away from the sun with the tree here, it can very possibly cause the highlights to become too light, because the meter wants to sort of compromise between this whole scene, between dark and light, and if it compromises in such a way that you're going to get highlights that are just a little bit too light, where you lose texture and detail, the picture will be worthless. Let me do a vertical of this. Again, this bracket that I'm using here is from Really Right Stuff. It makes going from horizontal to vertical very easy and quick, as you can see. I think this is a really nice shot. There's an American flag here that gives a nice little bit of color and patriotism, and these headstones are from the 1800s, most of them. Okay, I've just changed position a little bit. I've gotten closer to the tree, and I've got my 16 to 35 millimeter wide angle lens on, and as I point the camera up, the tree is just dramatically elongated. This is one of the beauties of using a wide angle lens, where you can just exaggerate perspective like that. And now I've got the bright sky back there, so instead of underexposing by 2/3, I'm actually going to overexpose by 2/3 right now, because that sky is going to influence the meter. Remember that meters want to give you a middle gray scene. They want to look at every scene and say, oh, that's middle gray. Well, if you're photographing a tree or a person, that's fine. But if you're photographing snow or bright sky, that's not fine, because you don't want the snow to be middle gray, and I don't want that sky to be middle gray. So I'm going to lighten it up a little bit to prevent unwanted underexposure. So, okay. And I take my hands off the camera because I don't want any vibration. I don't even want to hold the camera while it's going through its exposure sequence, because just me holding it can cause some vibration. Notice how my tripod legs are spread out. That's just, most tripods do that, but if yours doesn't, you're going to want that feature. This center column should actually be cut off so I can get down flat to the ground. I just haven't done that yet. Okay, let's move to a different location. I've chosen this location for a couple of reasons. First, because the headstone is facing toward the light. Many of these headstones are facing the opposite way, which would be good in the late afternoon, but this is the morning, and I wanted the detail of the stone facing the camera. Also, I like the fact that the ground here is carpeted with leaves. It's absolutely beautiful. So I've gotten very low, and I'm using again my 16mm. So I'm getting basically this and all back here. The sun has become somewhat diffused with a cloud cover. So now we have soft lighting, which is perfectly fine. There are many, many compositions here. Everywhere I look, it's great. Again, I'm focusing about 8 feet away from the camera, so I would say the far edge of that middle headstone is where I'm focusing. And I'm using f/22, so everything from right here to as far as I can see will be sharp. I like how these leaves are so close to the camera position, because again, you have that elongation of perspective, and the foreground actually seems disproportionately large compared to how I see it with my eyes. But in terms of art, I think that's a great technique. So let me move a little bit over here, being careful to keep the tripod legs out of my picture, of course. My exposure is a 1/4 second, and the flags blowing in the wind will be a little bit blurred, but that doesn't really bother me, to be honest. There's another headstone right over here that has a very unique shape. Let's go over there. I'd like to get a low-angled shot of that too. Actually, let me see. This tree is really nice. Very strong graphic design. Let's see what this looks like being backlit. Okay. So I've got a silhouette of the tree. I've got lens flare again because I'm including the sun in the composition, but there's nothing I can do about that, and so I will eliminate that later in Photoshop. Let's see what that looks like. I like that a lot. Notice I'm not even blocking the lens with my hand as I talked about before, because the sun is in the frame. If the sun were just outside the frame, then it would work. Then I could block the lens flare, and I wouldn't have to spend time in Photoshop later. This is a very interesting composition. That tree is very dramatic. and very graphic. And I can see where the lens flare is coming into my picture. I can use the clone tool and get rid of that pretty easily. Sometimes lens flare covers parts of the picture that you really can't clone. For example, if the lens flare were covering some of the lettering on the headstone, you know, if it's coming across a J and there's no other J in the writing, how do you get rid of that? It's really tough. Okay, let's keep moving here because there are a lot of possibilities and I don't want to waste the nice light that we have. I found this beautiful detail on this headstone of somebody who died in 1882. It says father on here in beautiful script and it's framed in these oak leaves that have a nice relief to it. And I want to make the point that when you photograph flat art, which this basically is, you want the back of the camera as parallel as possible to the plane of the subject. The reason is because, first of all, there's no distortion, because even if you're a little bit off center, it's askew just a little bit. And second, because that helps you with your depth of field, with your focus, because all the points from the sensor to the plane of the subject are equidistant. And that helps you with maintaining complete depth of field pretty much at any lens aperture. I'm still using a small lens aperture because there's a depth here. From the surface of the leaf to the back part of this carving, it's about, oh, I don't know, an inch maybe, or 3/4 of an inch. And when I'm this close, I have to have that entirely sharp. So I still have my mirror lockup going on, and I put this right in the center of the frame to really underscore the symmetry. I think this is a beautiful shot. At the back of the cemetery, there's this really beautiful stone wall. It's got to be here for well over 100 years, or maybe even 150. And there's some beautiful red leaves that have fallen, so I thought the color contrast was really beautiful. Let's take a shot of that. Again with the wide angle lens, and again from a low perspective. I'm going to shoot down the wall, but the sun just came out down there. The sun's been changing all morning, and this section here is in shade. That highlight I'm going to avoid because, well, look at that, it just went away. If you have a shaded subject and a sunny background, that's not going to work. It'll almost never work. So even if you have patchy lighting, most of it's shade with a little bit of highlight there, you're going to blow out the highlight, because if you expose for the shade, you have nice tones here. The highlight cannot help but be too light or completely blown out. So that's why you want to avoid it. This is really nice. I'm going to move back and include a little bit more of these leaves. Okay, let's do one more close-up of this rock here. Notice that I'm using my wide-angle lens fairly close to the subject. A lot of photographers don't use their wide-angle as a lens where you can get really, really close to something, and I think it's an effective kind of perspective. This is beautiful. I like the lichen on the rock as well. This kind of exposure is very easy because everything is middle toned. Any kind of exposure mode will work. Program, aperture priority, shutter priority. It'll all give you the same reading with a middle tone subject like this. This is what meters are designed for. But as soon as you throw in patchy lighting, or contrasty backlighting, then you have to be careful. You have to monitor the LCD readout here so you can see exactly where your exposure is. Okay, right behind me, there's a headstone by itself that I like very much with leaves all around it. Let's go over here. What is so nice about this is the fact that you have all these red leaves that are freshly fallen. You know, when leaves lay on the ground for a while, they start to turn brown, but these are fresh, and that's why they have such nice color. So, because this is a symmetrical kind of subject, I'm going to put the camera right in the middle, and I'm going to make sure that the top of the viewfinder is parallel with the top of the stone. I don't want it askew at all. Perfect. Let's just do a vertical of that. I lowered my camera down so I did not include this stone, just all these leaves and this small headstone here. I'm going to switch to my telephoto lens now because I can see some compression shots that I think would be really nice in many directions. I raised up my tripod now because I want to get a telephoto shot of this row of headstones. They're going to be semi-silhouettes because the sunlight on the leaves behind them is much brighter than they are. I like the flag there, and I can get the whole back of the cemetery, and all those stones are like rim lit or edge lit from the sun. The sun has been, as I said, coming in and out, but right now it's out, and I really like the lighting. So I'm going to come in a little tighter. I'm focusing on the second stone in there, not the first and not way out there. And I'm at f/22, aperture priority. I feel that will give me the most depth of field for this situation. I also notice as I look down here to my left, the base of this tree is really beautiful. Just like the rocks we just photographed over there, you've got this gray color against the red and yellow leaves. It's really beautiful. And I think it'll make a nice frame-filling shot. In fact, it does. Let me move back just a little bit. This is really pretty. However, because the sun is out now, there's a little bit of patchy lighting there that isn't working. I could tone that down in Photoshop, but you really want to avoid patchy lighting at all costs. Okay, let's see what else I can do here. Let's see. Have a shot over there. Oh, this is sort of nice. Again, back to that stone wall with a telephoto lens. I was looking again at this stone wall because the leaves come right up to it and it's really nice. But there's some patchy lighting there that I have to avoid, so I'm going to come over here and shoot this section right here. Okay, I like that too. The reason that I avoided this section over here again was because a little bit of sunlight was coming through the trees and it makes exposure impossible. Yes, you could handle that with HDR, but even with HDR sometimes it looks unreal. And so I wanted softer lighting and just moved a few feet to my left, and now this area of the rocks and the leaves were totally in shade, no exposure problem at all. Just for fun, I put my 15mm fisheye on because there's some really beautiful trees here, and I know that when you shoot straight up at them with this extreme wide angle, it can be quite compelling. You can include like the sun way over there, as well as the whole tree and stuff way back here. So I'm going to shoot right up the trunk to get that elongation, and very dramatic. It's very cool. I can walk around here, hide the sun a little bit maybe at the edge of the tree. It's just a real different kind of a look. What I would really like to find is a stand of red maple leaves as well as the yellow, and then shoot up at that. That's really incredible. This is good, but when you have the introduction of that red, it's even better. I'm here at Nubble Light in York, Maine, and the last hour or two, the sky has been really milky. I was afraid we wouldn't have a sunset, but miraculously, like 5 minutes ago, the sun came out just below the clouds and lit up the lighthouse absolutely beautifully. What's so dramatic about this is that we have the yellow golden light of sunset, and the background sky is this, it's like a blue-gray. And when this is reproduced in the digital file, the contrast will be really, really strong. There's some telephone wires here on the left that are obnoxious, and I will definitely clone those out. If I want to get all the buildings in the lighthouse and around it, you have to include those wires and the poles, but trust me, those will be cloned out first thing on my computer. There's a flag flying there, and when I shoot, I'm going to wait for the flag to get as full as possible so I can see the entire area of the flag. Otherwise it won't look as good. So I'm going to do both horizontal and vertical, and my ISO here is 100. I don't need speed. And the other thing that I don't need is depth of field. Because everything is, optically speaking, there's no foreground. So there's no reason to use f/16 or 22. I can shoot wide open actually if I want to, and everything will be perfectly sharp. The sharpest point of a lens is about 2 f-stops down from open. So if you have a f4 lens, the sharpest point is usually about f8. And so in this case, that's a good thing to do. The shutter speed, unless you want a blurred flag, should be fast enough to freeze that flag. And I'm using right now a 2/50th of a second. That's plenty. We have probably 10 or 15 more minutes of this wonderful light. There's another thing that I notice. The actual light in the lighthouse is red, and it shows up every few seconds, and that's a really nice thing to capture. Just a little bit of glow there. The light is fading really fast right now. Let me tell you what I'm not doing. I'm not using a polarizing filter. A lot of photographers, in trying to make more contrast between the sky and the lighthouse, use a polarizing filter, but at this time of day, it won't have any effect on the horizon. A polarizer has maximum polarization at 90 degrees to the sun or to the light. So right now that would be straight up. At noon, maximum polarization is near the horizon. So since the sun is setting in the west and we're facing east, it would have no effect at all. At this lighthouse, there's really only 1 or 2 compositions. I'm down here in the rocks, and the other one would be up by the parking lot, and that's really it. At Portland Head, we had a lot of variety, but with Nubble, there's just one place to shoot.
Mastering photography takes persistence and practice. Stay with it and look forward to future installments from the PhotoMasters edition of the Ultimate Photo Guide Digital Photography Series.
I want to show you quickly about the Actions palette and how to make your own custom actions. This area right here is the Actions palette. If it's not up on your desktop, you can open it under Window, Actions right there. The way that you can make your own custom actions, it's very simple. It's about 4 steps, and here's how you do it. In the upper right hand corner, there's a little icon right here. And if you click that, it pulls down all this stuff. So the first thing you do is you choose button mode. And now you get this. Then you hit the same little icon here, get the same pull down menu, and now you choose new action. So the new action that I'm going to choose is, I'm going to call it expand. Expand means when you have a selection, you can expand it and make it a little bigger. I do it all the time when I'm doing my cut and paste technique to composite photographs. You can choose a color. That's how I got the colors in the palette, and let's go with green. You can choose a function key, and this translates to the keys on your keyboard, the F keys. You don't have to do that, doesn't matter really. If you don't use your function keys, don't worry about it. I go record. The next step, the same little button here, the same pull down menu. I now go insert menu item. The reason why you have to do this is because when you type in expand or unsharp mask or save as, whatever the command is, that tells you what the button is, doesn't tell the computer what it is. So when I go insert menu item, now I go to select, modify, expand. It's right here. Now the computer knows what to do. You go OK, and then the last step, well, second to the last step, the same little icon, and you go stop recording. To get back to the buttons, same little icon, go button mode, and it's right there, expand. That's how you make custom actions in an action palette. I thought I would show you some examples of what I can do with Photoshop in terms of the pictures that I've been photographing in New England. Photoshop enables you to do an unlimited number of things to your pictures, and this first example that I'd like to share with you is one of my favorite plugins. It's called Flood, and it's made by the company Flaming Pear. Their website is flamingpear.com. What Flood does is it puts in realistic reflections in your pictures. You can design the ripples, you can design everything about the reflection you want and get an incredible result. So the first picture that I want to start with is this beautiful setting of Nubble light. This was taken at twilight. I photographed sunset and then waited long enough to get the really beautiful cobalt colors in the sky versus the afterglow on the lighthouse. Nubble light sits on an island, and there's some ocean right in front of it. But if you want to create a classic reflection, reflecting the lighthouse, the sky, and the little bit of light that you can see in the tower there, the first thing I'm going to do is add some additional area under my picture. I'm going to basically take this horizontal landscape shot and make it a vertical to give me enough room for a reflection. And the way I'm going to do that is by going to Image, Canvas Size. Adobe calls your picture area, the canvas, and the dialog box that you get shows you this tic-tac-toe box. The gray area in the middle represents your photograph. So if I click up here, that means that this is the picture, and the new area I'm going to add is going to fall below the picture, so it'll be at the bottom of it. The amount of picture area I'm going to add, what I basically do is double this. I take the height and I double it, so that's about 11. And I click OK, that's all there is to it. And it puts a white area below, and the color that goes down here, it doesn't really matter, but the color that goes down here happens to be the background color at the bottom of the tools palette. If I want to see the entire area of the photograph with the new area, you can double click the hand, and there it is. Okay, here's my vertical picture. Now let's add the reflection. I'm going to go under the filter menu and find flaming pair, and then go to flood. Here is the dialog box, and it's really very easy to navigate. The number one thing that you first have to establish is the horizon line. By moving this slider, you can move the horizon line up and down. Obviously that's not what we want, but look how high I can make the horizon. I can make the lighthouse look, well, like there's no island at all, like it's just sticking up just above the water line. I can even go higher and make it look like it's been, like there's been a big flood and it's partially submerged. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it back down here, right at the bottom of those rocks. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that this technique looks best when you're using a subject at a distance, because the water line that it's placing here is a straight razor edge line. So if you're too close, that kind of razor edge water line doesn't look natural. But at a distance, it's actually what we see. And the further away you get, the more defined, more sharp that line is. So this island was, a ways away, and so this is going to look quite natural. The sliders that you have over here give you all the controls for your waves. So for example, if we make the altitude 0, no waviness, no complexity, we have a mirror reflection. And if this were a lake or a small body of water, you could have that if there's no wind. This could be absolutely appropriate. Or if you want to introduce some waviness, then we start playing with basically these three sliders: the altitude, waviness, and complexity. And you can see this in real time. So as you move it, you can have a lot of waviness, or just a little bit, just a hint of the water's movement. So let's decide what we want here. Brilliance has to do with light and dark. I don't move that too often. I don't use blur at all. I've already established my horizon, and let's see, let's get a little more complexity. Okay, well, no, that's too much. Whoops. I'd like to keep the definition of the lighthouse. Sometimes it's hard to decide exactly what's going to look real, but you just have to keep playing with it until you like something. Okay, let's go with that. I click OK. Now I've reduced this file size just to, well, with the additional bottom portion, it's 15 meg, so for demonstration purposes it goes pretty quickly. But normally I work on a 50 megabyte file for maximum resolution. But here you can see a reflection. It looks just like I was standing there in front of a body of water. Of course, the ocean was there, but you couldn't see the lighthouse very well because the distance and the angle, it just didn't work out. This is classically beautiful now. So I'm going to save this. In my actions palette, I have some of the actions that I use. I'll give it a new number, and then I'll save it. Okay, let me show you one more example of flood. I'm going to open a fall photograph that I took in New England, and I love this picture because you've got a nice contrast between the bare trees in the front, which have a cool or bluish cast, and the warm autumn foliage trees in the background are just beautiful. So the first thing I'm going to do to this picture is increase the saturation just a little bit. I do that in the hue and saturation dialog box, and all I have to do is move the saturation slider to the right. Okay, now I'm going to add just a little bit of contrast using the levels dialog box. You don't see me pulling these menus down because I use shortcuts. Photoshop has a ton of shortcuts. See, I could go Image, Adjustments, there's my hue and saturation, and levels is right there. But next to many of the commands in Photoshop, you see these little symbols here, and those are your shortcuts. On a Mac, this little symbol means Command. On a PC, it'll be Control. So L is for levels. So Command or Control L would open up the levels dialog box. And for hue and saturation, you have U for hue. Control or Command right there. So this is what I do most of the time. So to open levels, for example, just Command L because I'm on a Mac. So I'm going to move this to the right just a little bit to darken it and enrich those colors. Okay, let's make this a little smaller. And this is a horizontal picture. I'm going to end up with a vertical, and I want enough room at the bottom to make the reflection. So I'm going to go to Image, Canvas Size. And remember, this gray area here represents the photograph, so I'm going to put it up here. And the arrows indicate where the new area will be created. I'm going to take my height and approximately double it. If I double click the hand now, you see the entire picture area. So I'm going to open up the filter flood now by going to Filter, Flaming Pair, and then Flood. This automatically shows up in your filter pull-down menu when you load the software. It opened up actually with the horizon line in a perfect position. I can move this around. You can see it changing the horizon level. I think actually 50 is perfect. This gives me the entire length of the tree trunks. And again, with altitude, waviness, and complexity, you have a lot of possibilities in giving you different kinds of waves. My feeling is that in a small body of water, you wouldn't have a lot of waves. There's just not enough wind to make big waves. So what I tend to do with ponds or small lakes is make minimal reflections, and that's what I've done here. So I'll just hit OK. And there's the reflection. The last thing that I could do, now I think this is perfect. It's beautiful, it's realistic, but many times reflections are just a little bit darker than the top portion of the image. So I'm going to take the rectangular marquee tool. This is one of the selection tools in Photoshop. One of the powers of Photoshop is that you can select an area and do something just to that area, but not to another area. So I have the reflection selected, and I'm now going to feather the edge just a little bit, because if I don't, that top edge will be razor sharp and it just wouldn't look realistic. I can go to feather right here, select, modify, feather. This is where it hides. But the actions palette is another shortcut, and so I click just feather here, and here's the feather dialog box. I'm going to choose 1 pixel. A 1 pixel feather doesn't make the edge unrealistically blurred. It makes it just soft enough so it seems to blend in with the background naturally. I'm going to click OK. You really can't see what it does, but after the effect is applied, if you were to blow it up to, let's say, 200%, you would see it. So I'm going to hide the edges with Command or Control H, and then with Command or Control L, I'll bring up my levels dialog box. And here I can darken the bottom portion of the picture just enough so it looks like it's really a body of water reflecting that top portion. Another thing that I could do, the reflection is probably not going to be as intense as the colors above. So let me open up the Hue and Saturation dialog box, Command or Control U, and I'm now going to desaturate this just a little bit. I don't want to lose the beauty of those trees, but now it's just a little softer. Everything that you can do to make this look realistic, that's what we want to do. Let me blow this up so you can see these ripples. Doesn't that look realistic? It's not too much, not too little, it's just perfect. So I will click my hand again, double click, and there's the finished product. So I'm going to save this. Again, I could go File, Save As. Remember the difference between Save As and Save. Save As means that you must give it a new name and the original picture is preserved. If I go Save, then this picture is saved over the original and the original is gone, and now this replaces it. So I want to preserve the original. I'll go Save As, or I can go to my Actions palette and hit Save As, and there it is. So I will give this a new name. Well, let's just make up a number right here. Here's the finished product, and I think this looks absolutely real. The problem with this picture, as you can see, because the wide angle lens I used was angled upward and the back of the camera was oblique to the plane of the facade of the church, you get this distortion, and most people consider this undesirable. We accept it because that's what we have, but it would be really nice to be able to correct it. So let me show you a technique in Photoshop that's one of my favorites for correcting things like this. And the procedure is very simple. It just takes sometimes several steps to do it. The first thing you do is select the photograph. And you can do that here with Select All, or the shortcut Command or Control A. That puts the marching answer on your picture. And then after that, you go Edit, Transform, Distort. I have this as a shortcut in my Actions palette. When you apply the Distort filter, it puts a box around your picture, and you can see little handles to the box in each corner of your picture. There's a little square there and a little square there. There are also handles midway on all sides. Here it is here in the top and the side and so on. What this allows you to do is pull and drag the corners of this picture so you can undistort it, so to speak. So let's do that. The first thing I want to do is align the bottom of the church, the steps, with the bottom edge of the frame. That's easily done right here. Take this little box and drag it, and now it's perfectly parallel. Then I'm going to take this box up here, because you see the whole right side of the church is leaning. This whole side here is leaning down. This cross piece right here should be parallel with the top and bottom of the frame. So I'm going to raise that up like that. The church is still leaning to the right just a little bit. So let's take this corner now and pull it over here. And we need another correction on this side, but first we have to go enter or return and then do it again. Select all. I'm going to use my shortcut Command A, distort, and then I'm going to raise this up. I'm going to hit enter or return. What this looks like now, it looks like I was standing right in the middle of the church. We still have the convergence of the lines, but that whole leaning thing was been taken care of. This kind of distortion that is left is acceptable to many people, but let's just say you wanted to straighten the verticals. You can do it, but what you're going to end up doing is sacrificing this beautiful frame of autumn foliage. I really like this picture, and as far as I'm concerned, it's finished. But let me show you what is possible if you really want those vertical lines to be perfectly parallel with left and right side of the frame. I'm going to go select all again. This time, instead of using distort, I'm going to use edit, transform, perspective. You get the same box around your picture, but now what happens is that the image is going to be brought out to the side, both sides the same. It's like a symmetrical change. So watch, I can take either the left corner or the right corner box and drag it outward, and look what happens to the lines. They begin to get more vertical. Yes, the church is being squished down, but we'll take care of that later. This isn't perfect, but it's much better. I'm going to hit enter or return to say, okay, I accept that. Then I'll do it again. Select all. This time, I'm going to hit edit, transform, scale. And I'm going to take the center box and raise up the church to eliminate some of that distortion. I ran out of area on my monitor, so let me go OK, and I'll do it again. Edit, transform, scale. Grab this, raise it up higher. You see how much of the leaves we've lost? But look at the church. It's almost correct now. Let me hit return. Do it again. Command A. Edit, transform, scale. Bring the church up now to its correct height. Now it's still leaning a little bit, so I'll hit return or enter again, Command A again, and this time distort. We want to bring this over just a little bit. There. Now, look at that. The church is its full height. All of the vertical lines are vertical. Look at the sides of the building and that they're almost exactly parallel with the left and right side of the frame. The problem, of course, is that you've lost the foliage. So, in this particular case, you had to sacrifice that if you wanted all those lines vertical. If you accepted the convergence of the edges of the building, but corrected the leaning like we did earlier, then you wouldn't have lost all that foliage. I'd like to share another idea with you that many people want to know how to do it correctly, and that is to put a moon in a sky. The problem is you cannot photograph a night or twilight scene and get a proper exposure and expose correctly for the moon. The reason is because the contrast is too extreme. If you exposed for the moon, which is very bright, the ground will be way, way too dark. If you expose for the ground, a skyline or a desert landscape at twilight or whatever, the moon will be completely overexposed, blown out with no detail. I'm sure you've seen many people photograph pictures where they include the moon and the moon is just like a white disk. That's not very attractive. So it has to be done in two images. You expose correctly for the moon, and then you expose correctly for the landscape or the skyline, or in this case, what I'm going to show you is a lighthouse. What I'm going to do is put in a crescent moon. Instead of putting a full moon in, which to be honest looks fake too much of the time, I'm going to put a thin crescent moon in because it's beautiful, elegant, and in this particular lighting situation, it'll work perfectly. So I've opened the lighthouse picture, and in CS4, you have these tabs up at the top here. So if you have two pictures open, instead of having two separate images, they're combined, and you can just go from one to the other by clicking the tab right there. Here's my crescent moon. Let me tell you how to expose for the moon first. The moon is almost as bright as daylight on Earth. So when you shoot the moon, you don't need a long exposure. You don't need a high ISO. What I do is I'll use 100 or 200 ISO, a shutter speed of a 2/50th of a second, and my aperture will be usually f8 or f11 depending on any atmospheric haze. If it's a clear night, then I'll use f11 at 200 and a 2/50th of a second, and that'll give me a good exposure. What you really want to retain is the detail in the lunar surface. You don't want to lose that detail at all. So the f11 aperture actually will make the moon a little bit dark, but then in RAW, you can open up the exposure as much as you feel is appropriate. So here's my thin crescent moon. The first thing I'm going to do is use the rectangular marquee and make a selection. You don't have to make a precise selection around the edges of the moon, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Now that I have my selection, I'm going to copy to the clipboard with Edit, Copy, or the shortcut, which you will need to memorize because you'll use it all the time, is Command or Control C. Now the moon is in what Adobe calls the clipboard, which is a temporary holding place, so the picture resides there waiting to be pasted into another picture. You cannot see the clipboard, but it's there. So now I'm going to go back to the lighthouse picture by hitting the tab up here. And to paste the moon into the sky, all I do is go Edit, Paste, or the shortcut is Command or Control V. There's the moon. Now, how do we move it where we want it? You do that by clicking on the Move tool, which is the upper right corner in the Tools palette. There's the Move tool right there. You click on that, and now you can move this. So we're going to put the moon right there. Obviously, we want to get rid of that dark blue background, and here's how you do it flawlessly. In the Layers palette, you have this little sub-menu. It begins with the word Normal. If you click on that, all of these words here indicate your blend modes. So what we want to do is lighten this picture because we want the background sky to basically lighten out of existence. Here's the lighten blend mode, and watch what happens when I choose it. All that's left is the light parts of that pasted in image, which is the moon, and what you eliminate are the dark parts. So now I have a perfect moon with no telltale dark line from the dark sky it came from. There's one thing left to do. It's not astronomically correct. The sun illuminates the moon, and so the face of the moon that's being illuminated has to face the sun. So we have to rotate it. And here's how we rotate it. Edit, transform, rotate, right there. Puts a box around the moon. You put your cursor outside the box and just rotate it at will. So now the moon is facing where the sun is just about to come up here in the sky. I click OK, which is enter or return, and it's still a floating layer. Remember that when you paste a picture into another picture, it's a floating layer, as indicated right here in the layers palette. So I can still move that anywhere I want. The move tool is still highlighted, so I can put that anywhere I want. When you're done, you can flatten the image. I have a shortcut here, but the pull-down menu is under Layer, Flatten Image. Many photographers keep their layers, and I do once in a while. But in this particular case, for example, the moon is exactly where I want it. I will never want to move it anywhere else. I will not want to make it bigger or smaller because it's a perfect size right now. And there's no reason to keep a layer because the only reason to keep a layer is to go back at some point in the future and make a change. But I don't need to do that. So I flatten the layer, and what that does is it reduces the file size, because after a while, and you have thousands of pictures, you're going to need lots and lots of hard drives, and so you want to save hard drive space. That's why I do it. If I think at some point in the future I will need to make a change to the picture, then I won't flatten it. So we will now save this picture, save as, and I'll just change the number here. And click Save. So here's the final picture. I have increased the saturation a little bit to make the sky even more dramatic. And what I love about this picture, beside the lighthouse itself, is that the windows are reflecting the golden sky that you can't see just out of the frame. These are just some examples of what I do in Photoshop. I really love this program because it enables me to do whatever is in my mind. In the beginning of photography, when I began my career 40 years ago, I did all of these wild special effects in the darkroom. But now in Photoshop, we can see things change right before our eyes in real time, no chemicals, and the possibilities are absolutely endless.